My name's Andrew Stubbs. Thank you all very much for coming. So Henya's already shouting at me to speak up because it can get quite noisy at the back. Last time we had a session in here, they decided to start knocking a wall down upstairs, and it was absolute chaos. So if you can't hear me, please wave, and we will speak up.
Or move forward. There's quite a lot of space at the front too. So.
I'd like to introduce our star performer, James Banks from London Funders, who's going to come and talk about sort of gold at the end of the rainbow, maybe, or maybe not. My colleague Carla and my colleague Sam. Carla's going to talk a bit about HR and data protection, and Sam's going to talk a little bit about property issues. I've had the pleasure of being given this talk from Chris because he's been infected by norovirus, which down in so he's decided best not to come and give it all to you, so it does me to do it. So I will be reading his slides, so forgive me if I'm not totally fluent. But spring into 2024, a review of what's been going on and a little bit about what we think might be happening. Please ask questions as we go through. There'll be some time for Q&A at the end, I hope. But quick hand up and ask questions during the conversation.
Yes, will you be letting us have a copy of these slides?
I'm sure. Yes, we are. That's it. So, first one, which won't surprise you at all, the pressure, the economic pressure on charities. I'm not going to dwell on this too long. Obviously, increased costs for everybody in every walk of life, but much greater demand on charities. Local government finances shot to pieces, affecting funding contracts. Apparently a 4% reduction in voluntary sector workforce, according to the NCBO Civil Society Almanac. And one of the most alarming bits of information was the MPC State of the Sector 2024 review, which talks about only a quarter of charities having automatic inflation increase in their contracts. So if you think about somebody having a 3-year funding agreement over the last 3 years, they're 30% down or something like that, I'm a mathematician. But that's pretty bad. 62% of charities don't think that they receive full value, full cost recovery, we used to call it. And the average charity thinks they contribute 35% to the contract value. That's quite alarming because charities aren't really meant to be supporting state services. Lots of these services are voluntary state services, they're not statutory state services. But we had this conversation 15 years ago about full cost recovery. It was the thing everybody talked about. That's what we were meant to be doing in the sector, but we've gone backwards on that one. The other point is, I think there's a general perception that there is now less space for thinking, sky thinking, or whatever we want to call it, and more people are just focusing on the day-to-day survival. I think that's obviously problematic for things moving forward. AI. Chris loves his AI. NCBO apparently said, well, AI profoundly impacts how we work. Many organisations are unprepared. I can tell you many law firms are also quite unprepared, but we have grasped this now. And I think it clearly has potential to be amazing in many ways for sort of mapping beneficiary needs and building big models of stuff. But it's full of risks. We talk about hallucinations, or people talk about hallucinations. There have been quite amusing court cases where somebody has put in a statement with lots of cases, and the cases have been totally made up by AI. The judge, I think, was not that amused. So I think it has potential to be really useful. We've adopted a policy within Russell-Cooke, which basically says, please try it. Please start playing with it. Please see what it can do. But don't you dare send anything out that's based on AI, because we can't necessarily, you need to be able to check all your facts and all your cases and all the rest. It will make things up if they can't find anything specific. So you need to be a bit careful about that. I think you will probably be more familiar with this, probably with your charity hats on, but there's a lot of concern also about automated decision making and the inbuilt biases that people face. So I think lots of charities are very alert to that, and they're campaigning to make sure that decisions that should be made by a human with all sorts of facts and figures and bases for making decisions are not just automated computers of the know. So do have an AI policy is the thing he recommends. Charity Commission, few things changing here. They've just announced their new 5-year strategy. I have to say, we have a bit of a go at the Commission quite often, especially when they're being nasty to our clients. But it is a complex and difficult thing to regulate. As a sector, it's very complicated and different sizes and different layers of complexity, different areas. So they've come up with a proposal that they aim to be fair, balanced, and independent, unless, of course, you're extremely rich and wealthy, in which case they will do what you say. Don't repeat that. Regulation to promote public trust and confidence. That is their primary objective under the Charities Act, is to make public trust and confidence in charities, and to begin to use technology and the charity register more effectively than it's been used recently. One of the things they have introduced is a new annual return, which has got another dozen or so questions in it. So they're gathering more information so that they can put it into the register and therefore identify themes coming from particular charity areas or particular types of charity. They've also introduced a new My Charity account if you want to be the registered person to upload things to the Charity Commission register. It's quite a faff. I think we've got it working in some occasions, but don't do that on the day you need to file your account. Do it about a month before, work out glitches, and then do that. New CEO, David Holdsworth, who is an old hand at the Commission, replaces Helen Stevenson. I think that is less important than the change of the chair, who has a bit more sort of overboard in its strategy. New guidance, investing charity money, that's just updated to reflect the change from the Butler-Sloss case, which was the ethical investment case, explaining to charity trustees that they can actually invest in good things, but they mustn't allow personal preferences to override the general wants and best interest of the charity. Social media, increasingly important in some people's lives, certainly for charities communicating with potential donors. Again, they have said you must have a policy in place about how you're going to use social media. They recognise that people have a freedom of expression, but trustees have to take action where something is posted by an individual who is clearly associated with the charity, which has a negative effect on the charity. Now, that's going to be quite interesting how they actually police that. But I think if you are CEO of ABC charity, even if you said, these are my views, not ABC charity, you have to expect that you are associated with that charity. You need to be a little bit cautious. And the Commission also saying charities should communicate with respect and tolerance, which is interesting. We'll see how that works out. Technical changes about how you can change your charity's governing document. I'll come back to that because that's a Charities Act implementation point. And new guidance recently about accepting, refusing, and returning donations. The main point is that the Charity Commission expects you to keep any money that you're given. You've got to have very good reasons to refuse. They can either have illegal conditions attached to it, in which case you've got to refuse it. If it comes from a known terrorist organisation, probably best to refuse that one as well. But it's the marginal ones. It's the president of some big fundraising party, which is rather unsalubrious, and things like that, where the money has come from a tainted Sackler is the current one, the American drugs company that has allegedly caused all the opium addiction. There's a big Sackler Foundation that funds the arts. There's also a bit of a kickback now against the fossil fuel companies as to whether actually a children's charity should accept money from a fossil fuel where climate change is going to damage the children's future. So some interesting questions there. I'm sure we'll have a bit more to go on that. Sorry, conscious of time. When have I got? 2 minutes? Charities Act. There's been lots of people have asked us about why haven't you said lots of things about the Charities Act? It's actually very useful for practitioners for releasing permanent endowment, how you go about changing charities, governing documents, and things like that. But it's not something that every charity has to react to today. There's not a great long list of to-dos as there were in the 2006 Charities Act. So you can relax generally. You don't need to take home homework. But there are some new rules about releasing permanent endowment. They've just upped the threshold. So I think if you've never got a permanent endowment, which is a fund you can spend the income from the capital. Sometimes they become quite tricky. If you've only got £24,000 worth of capital, it's not going to produce a vast amount of income. It's not life-changing amounts of money. So the Commission recognises in certain circumstances, you should be able to release that and just spend capital. So they've made the rules slightly easier. Amending governing documents, again, this is really rather technical. It's bringing all the different types of charities. So you used to have different regimes for how they went about changing governing documents, in particular, changing your charity's objects or trustee benefits, which are generally called regulated alterations. So they brought them together. So it's broadly the same test. And as far as charities' objects are concerned, it's basically the idea is they should be similar to the current objects and they should be reflective of the current social and economic climate. So it's broadly the same, but now there is a proper test in place. You'll talk about land disposals, I'm sure.
Some objects, just to enlarge on that.
Yeah.
So you can amend the charity objects to something similar yourself.
No, you still need charity commission consent.
It's got
the charity commission will say this is nothing to you move from relief of poverty to advancement of education.
Yeah, but I mean, why? On the existing, under the existing heads, let's say a head, I know it continues to exist.
Yeah.
In different forms. Within the existing heads, can you change the wording of the objects in minor ways, or they've still got to approve?
Any change to your charity's objects requires charity consent.
You've
still got to, but when you go to the commission, you can now frame your changes in a more effective way. Yeah. So you can put good reasons why it reflects social and economic circumstances to them. So it helps us to help you in that sense, because we know what the commission's going to come back with, subject to the case officers all reading the same guidance. Okay, general election. This is going to be fun. Culture wars. We're looking forward to that. I'm rather looking forward to the culture wars rather than the politicians myself. But the main point here is, yes, it's an election period. The election rules come into force as far as amounts of money you can spend if you're registered. I don't think many charities are registered with the Electoral Commission, but the big point is the Charities Commission's guidance on campaigning, which you really ought to test any campaign you've got against CC9, which is their guidance. The guidance is pretty clear, and the main point is, so long as you are campaigning in pursuance to your objects. So any campaign has got to be with a view to achieving your charitable objectives. And so long as you're not party political, you can be as political as you like, but you cannot support one party over another party, obviously. So you shouldn't really be endorsing one party's policy over another. You can say the effect of a particular policy is a good thing, but actually aligning yourself with a political party is where the Commission will get interested. And as soon as you align yourself with somebody, everybody else, well, not everybody else, but lots of other people go, oh, this is political, because that will be part of the culture. So it will be interesting to see, but if you are campaigning, and I encourage you all to do so, just make sure you're in CC9, which is the Commission's guidance. And Chris puts a little note, actually, the NPC, what are NPC again? Remind me. New Philanthropy Capital, sorry. New Philanthropy Capital's report says that actually only a small minority of the public, 15%, think charities are too political. So I think you probably have your public behind you. Very quickly, sorry, some Yes.
A question about
yes, please.
Around the elections, so I'm presuming everyone knows about the recent incident with a particular Black member of a political party. And we are a Black feminist organisation. And a lot of our staff are asking us to comment internally, externally. But my worry is I don't want us to be seen political because that person is a particular party that it relates to. So what is your
what are your charitable objectives?
Right. Okay, so it needs to be aligned with that. Okay.
Oh, so if it's internal, I don't think it would be caught by the campaigning anyway.
Yeah.
So if what they're on
talk, right? You like.
But if you want to make a statement on social media or on your website,
no, we wouldn't be doing that.
No.
It's more internal.
So internal, I don't think there is a problem to say you don't endorse the zillionaires' comments.
Yeah.
But you need to be very careful if you were to say that publicly if your objectives are promotion of environmental sustainability.
Yeah,
because it's not directly as relevant, but it's not directly relevant. So you need to just be cautious.
Okay. Right.
We had who else was we were making?
It's quite a bit with Gaza in Israel. Like quite a few charities staff feel very strongly that a charity should be making a statement.
Yeah.
And you do need to really think carefully about how does making a public statement on that actually kind of further your objects. And a lot of charities have just stood quite firm and said, for the charity, it's kind of not part of what we do. So yeah.
Brilliant. Very swiftly, Companies House changes. Now these are slightly innocuous, but they're going to have far-reaching impact. They're quite technical. They are going to require in the future individual directors and company secretaries and people with significant control, shareholders, to be verified as proper human beings rather than something else. It introduced a new provision called the failure to prevent fraud for large charities or for large companies. So if you're a company charity, you've got over 32 million, I think, of turnover, that will affect you. The idea is just to prevent the use of companies for fraud, basically. So they're just trying to crack down on who's who and the misuse of companies generally, but it's going to make lots of changes. So you can't just go and file documents at Companies House anymore. You've got to have been identified in order, or when it comes in, sorry, you will have to be a registered person that they know of who's being verified in order to file documents with Companies House.
You're talking about staff, the individual staff.
So company secretary or director will need to go through a verification.
But what a member of staff, like a CEO or something like that?
You're not verified. So they're also funding this whole program by increasing the charges for filing documents, etc. We always used to say Companies House were one of those passive regulators, a repository of information. They only got anxious when you failed to file accounts on time. I think you will find you'll get fined if you don't notify Companies House that a director has changed or a trustee has changed, or you fail to file your account, your articles, or changes to your articles. I think they're going to become much more aggressive in how we treat Companies House. So again, getting all that verification stuff sorted out long in advance before you need to file your accounts.
When are these changes?
Can I answer that after? There is a schedule of implementation. It's not immediately, but some of the less intrusive ones are started pretty shortly. So we do some research at the back, and others will take some time to do secondary legislation before they can actually implement it. So you'll see it.
How do you get verified?
Sorry?
How do you get verified?
We don't quite know that yet. That's one of the issues about who has the right to file. We're going to be doing a nice note on this, so you will get an update on it, I hope.
Do you think that will go back to CIOs as well?
Won't be CIOs, because CIOs aren't companies.
That's right.
Another good reason to be a CIO rather than a company. We are increasingly getting that vibe that actually being a CIO has got better than
Yeah.
When it was new, we were all a bit nervous about it. It seems to be working fine, and I think there are reasons to be moving them towards CIOs.
Yeah, no, it's not getting this problem.
And obviously you can convert a company into
You can.
Yeah.
You probably know how to do it.
I don't. Most things.
Just, I'm really conscious I can run my bit. There is a review of the Charity Governance Code, consultation on revised SORT, and the Commission issued a statement to the clearing bank saying, please be nice to charities. We've seen a lot of problems with charity bank accounts recently, being closed, no access to IC, shaking. It's a real problem. I can't offer a solution, but let's hope the Charity Commission is telling off is paid attention to. James, I'm sorry, I've rushed through that.
You rushed over, it's very always good. And your Andrew's actually our lawyer, so it's always good to be reassured that you know what you're talking about.
I'm not setting up a company.
So I'm James, I'm from London Funders. I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of what's happening in the funding landscape. I'm not legally qualified, so you can take this with absolute whatever it is when you don't need to be legally qualified to say something. So if you don't know about London Funders already, we're a cross-sector network of funders, so we bring together local authorities, Mayor of London, custom foundations, corporates, housing associations, social investment vehicles, anyone who puts cash into civil society in London. So it's about 180 different organisations, collectively giving out about £750 million a year within the capital. And our job is to bring them together to look at what's going on, how we can share insights, intelligence, and learning between them, how we can help people to collaborate together, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the future, and how we can try and get a sense of where we can achieve greater things together by working together across the funding community and across civil society than maybe we can when we're more isolated and working separately. I am going to tell you what we know about the funding picture and how that picture is changing. I'm going to use some data and insights from our members. I think these slides will come out to you afterwards. This is all on our website as well, with a bit more detail and a bit more narrative about what some of this means as well. So we do an annual survey of all of those member organisations, and we ask them how much money they're giving out, what they're spending on, how their priorities are changing, what they see on the horizon. Normally about 50% of members complete that survey, and it's a fairly representative group of people. So we're fairly confident the data is robust, and it seems to hang true when we have those conversations with a wide group of members. And it gives us that picture of what's going on with funding each year, how it's changing from year to year. And as I say, that's about £750 million that we're able to track across our membership each year. Importantly, although we're London funders, just under half of our members are actually national funders. So whilst a couple of the slides I'm going to talk you through do look very much at London, if you're a national charity or you work beyond London, quite a lot of the themes I'll talk about are still going to be quite relevant to your work, because our membership, although we talk about London a lot, our membership is more diverse than that. So those national funders have a footprint in London, but they're also funding beyond the capital as well. So the first couple of slides are looking at where there's changes in how people are thinking about cold spots in terms of funding. And this is where we do have more London-specific data. So we ask people where they're funding and where that money is going to. And we use heat maps that show you where there's a greater concentration of resources going into civil society. So the darker the purple, the more money, the brighter the yellow, the less money is going in. So there are some boroughs that are really identifiably cold in terms of the amount of money that's going there. It's like Bromley, Sutton, basically some of the outer London boroughs are less likely to get funding than inner London boroughs. There's other mapping on the London Funders website that talks you through some of the reasons why that's the case, because we know, for example, from Trust for London's poverty profile, that need has moved across London a lot faster than money has moved across London. Some of that is because of charity density. So there's a historic patterns of need in inner London. There's a greater number of charities in inner London boroughs. There's more people to give money to institutionally than you'll get in the outer London boroughs. So some of the conversations we're having now about how people are looking at those outer London boroughs and where there's interest in targeting those, how can we build the capacity in some of those boroughs? How can we be a bit more proactive about trying to get money there in terms of working with people in neighbouring boroughs or working with infrastructure organisations to try and grow a sector so that money can flow there? Because there's a real barrier sometimes that our members need somebody to give money to. If there's an organisation there delivering that purpose, it's hard for us to give money to them. So there's a bit of conversation on how to do capacity building and be more proactive as a funding community. We've also seen increased spending across our membership in recent years, but we're also starting to see a few more headwinds on the horizon. So nearly half of our members have said in the last year they've spent more money than they have in the years before. So through COVID, through cost of living, we've seen people increasing the amount of money they're giving out. Some of them are drawing down some of their rainy day money. Some of them are just delaying some future spend and bringing it forward into current years. But we're starting to see in the last couple of surveys, the number of people saying they're spending less is going up. And we're going to see that a bit more over the coming years, as well as the impact of that increased spend over the last couple of years starts to come through, as does some of the impact of economic volatility on people's investments and their ability to give out the proceeds of that. All of this also means that about 2/3 of our members are reviewing their strategies at the moment, which is almost unprecedented in terms of the amount of our members that are changing or thinking about changing their priorities at the moment. So it is quite an uncertain time in terms of asking for funding. You'll see a lot more consultations, a lot more work coming out from funders asking you about what they should be doing in relation to some of the challenges that we're facing. You'll also see them talking a lot more about the climate crisis and about equity and justice. So when we ask our members if there are changes in the themes that they're interested in, if they're looking at how they can move their investments into different places or try and prioritise new issues, climate change has started to increase over the last couple of years, but equity and justice even more so, particularly since the pandemic, particularly since the murder of George Floyd. People have become much more conscious that funding has not necessarily flowed to organisations who are led by and for minoritised communities in recent years, and a much bigger increase in sustained interest in prioritising equity and justice in the way that funding flows. There's also been moves towards funds being given to you for longer periods of time. So there's still quite a high concentration of our members who give out short-term project-based funding, sort of 1-year grants, but the number is starting to move more towards 4 years, 5 years is increasing, and we're seeing more members start to look at 10-year grants and whether they can give you that security over a longer period of time. Some of that sounds really positive, and when we talk to civil society groups, people say, yes, that's what we want. One of the unintended consequences of that we're looking at is what's the impact in terms of the number of organisations that get funded. Because if you give a grant out now for 10 years, you can't then give that grant out again. So there's the potential for less organisations to be funded, for those that aren't to be getting that funding over a longer period of time, if that trend continues. We're also seeing changes in how decisions are made about where funding gets allocated. So around 1 in 5 of our members now involve some kind of community voice in deciding where that money goes. And you'll see that they're also bringing in external experts to help advise about where funding flows as well. So a lot less purely internal decision-making happening in funding bodies, but a lot more engagement with communities. Some of that's about how programs get designed, but some of that, as with this slide, 1 in 5 are actually involving communities and residents on panels that make decisions about where that funding is going. And that number has been increasing in recent years. We're also seeing an increased emphasis on trust in the funding relationship, which again we think is positive. Hopefully you may have known at the start of the pandemic, London funders put out a statement called We Stand With the Sector, where we asked funders to sign up to say, we'll understand that this is an unprecedented time, we'll be flexible with you about how you use your money, about how your outputs are delivered, and what happens over this period. Over 400 funders signed up to that across the UK. And one of the big surprises for us, I think, was the number of civil society groups who got in touch who were surprised at the humanity that their funders had shown them during that time. And it sort of exposed for us that that relationship wasn't as strong as we thought it was. I've been 25 years asking for money before I came to work for funding organisations. And I thought they were all in an ivory tower. They didn't really know what was going on in the organisations that I was working with. But the people I work with now are just as passionate about communities as I was when I was delivering direct work. I think we haven't necessarily had that relationship of trust between funders, people spending money that we need if we're going to deliver the kind of change that we want. So building on the We Stand With the Sector statement, we've worked with IVAR on the Open and Trusting Grant Makers movement that's got over 100 of those funders now signed up to these 8 commitments about being more open, more transparent with you about how they're working, being more open to accepting risk, being much more conscious about what they're asking you for, not wasting your time and designing process and enable that grant management process to be much more open, much more trusting, and much more productive and impactful as a result. On the IVAR website, there's a list of all those organisations, so examples of what they're doing. They're trying to be more transparent and be more accountable about how they're doing their work. And the last bit I'll say is we've also seen a big increase in the appetite for collaboration. So during COVID, we supported the London Community Response, which was 67 of our members, giving out about £59 million across the year through a single application portal. And about 95% of our members now say they are planning to do some form of collaboration between funders in the coming years. So a much bigger move towards funders working together with each other to try and smooth some of the pathways to funding and trying to increase the amount of money that's available for certain causes. For us, that's seen as work on Propel, which is a new 10-year, £100 million collaboration to put together a group of funders focused on young people, the advice sector, building strong communities, with the first grants going out in that 10-year programme. And some work that we're doing with Andrew and others to look at how we can design some processes with funders that mean these kind of things become more normal, more easier to manage, and more straightforward in terms of how funding flows from the point you ask for it through to how it's awarded and how you're asked to report on the learning as it goes through. With Propel in particular, there's a big focus on that equity-led piece. So 85% of the grants from Propel have gone to groups led by and for marginalised communities, reflecting that interest in equity and justice from an earlier slide. So they were some of the headlines of what's going on in the funding sector. I can take questions or I can have them.
Yeah, if there are questions, be brilliant.
Sorry, it's not clear to me. You talk about the movement up and down here. What period are you taking? Are you taking up just the last 2 years?
Last 4 years. So we've been collecting the data for 4 years. So there's some things where we can see clear movements, and some things where the conversation says that has already moved on from where the data was. So, for example, on the impact of saying they're probably going to be spending less in the next year, that data is looking backwards. When we've had the conversation, people saying they're concerned about the money they've got right now to be able to commit, and that figure next year is likely to be higher on the number of people who are spending lower.
Yeah, on collaboration between funders, I know that Trust for London and Bridge House have sort of collaborated on certain programs. I mean, is that the sort of thing that you're talking about there? Is that kind of going to be more open as a possibility?
Yes, I think there are more funders who are conscious that they've got similar ambitions and similar aims. At the moment, you might be asked to fill in multiple application forms, multiple people for fundamentally the same work, where there's opportunities for them to come together and say, let's create a collaborative fund that means that we're being clear about our shared priorities and apply what's for it. There's that opportunity. Things like Propel that we coordinated provide that front for a lot of funders in the background to do it. But there's continued, I mean, sort of racial justice funding that City Bridge and Just have done recently are examples of some of the big ones still coming together. And I think there's also increased appetite to think about how funders work beyond money. So we support the London's Giving movement, which is place-based giving in the boroughs across London. And that's also looking at how you use community assets, business involvement, where the money can be amplified by working differently in a space, thinking about assets in the round rather than purely cash. So some of that collaboration is more than money, as well as...
Yeah, and I was also thinking of that in the longer term funding possibilities, something that could work very well.
Yes, indeed.
Engaging with communities, please. What does that look like? I'm thinking about the intelligence and Gallagher and sort of, you know, if you're in a set of paradigms.
Yes, yeah. So there's a variety of things. So using Propel as an example, there's a huge community consultation that happened across London where some community groups were funded to host community conversations. There's a data mapping piece. There was loads of fed into designing missions that were set up by the London Recovery Board that this then relates to. At a local level, you'll see particularly things like Islington Giving, Camden Giving, where they've got residents panels and young people's panels who come together to look at those applications and use that community intelligence that they naturally have to make decisions or to ask questions if people are making those applications. And again, we've got some examples I can include on the slides to send out that.
And are those individuals actually sort of paid for their time? Or
yes, in most cases they are, and we recommend that they are.
It is worth it after all,
and also it's trying to make sure we're valuing community expertise as well as professional expertise inverted commas. So yes, the normal recommendation is you pay at least London living wage.
It's really interesting.
Have you managed to make any progress in the city delivery companies, getting them to work together and getting it coordinated action? If not, what the difference?
To an extent, we have. I think same way as I'd say with charity funders, there's often a load of institutional barriers for why people are not doing things. We certainly saw, speaking fairly openly, we certainly saw at the start of COVID, people were very happy to do a collaboration behind the London Funders logo and brand because if it failed, it was okay for us to fail. It was not okay for respected institutions to fail. And we completely understand that, because if collectively people lost faith in some of the big funders who've been around for a long time, that had big impacts for how communities could function. So 3 months in, when the London Community Response was working, everybody wanted their logo on the front page, and we were able to do that. And I think some of that organisational pride in what we do can still act as a barrier to people collaborating. And I think some organisations who've been around for longer and have a greater sense of that pride need more conversation about how you can make that happen if I'm not being too obtuse.
I do choose.
Should we pause any further questions till the end? That's given you colour.
Yeah. So I'm going to spend around about 5 minutes on data protection and about 5 minutes on employment, which means it's going to be very, very high level. I'm going to be around afterwards if you do have any specific questions. And I'll hope that if I spend about 10 minutes, Sam will have a few words also to say on updates in the charity property world, and then there'll be time for some questions as well before we go off and enjoy a drink. So I started with the DPDI bill, which is the Data Protection and Digital Innovation Bill. It's been going through Parliament now for quite some time. It hit a bit of a hurdle where it sort of disappeared for a bit and came back as DPDI number 2 and was then rebranded again as just DPDI. I stood here actually, almost right here, about a year ago, and did quite a detailed overview of the draft legislation and said I was pretty confident that it would be enforced by the end of the year or by now, not least because it was actually due to expire this month, but it hasn't happened. It goes to the Lords tomorrow to start the really detailed committee stage reading in the Lords. There's 3 days, literally line by line examination. There's a huge, quite big document of proposed amendments that if you really want to look at, you can see on the website. In order to not make it expire this month, a carryover motion has been brought. And so that extends time until middle of December, which is basically the last day before Parliament has to dissolve anyway for a general election. So I'm hoping it's going to happen, but it is a bit more uncertain than it was a year ago. The really big poster thing for the DPDI for charities was always the change to the requirement to always get consent to send electronic marketing. And the suggestion that charities would be able to use what's called the soft opt-in, so essentially legitimate interests, to send supporters more information about the work you're doing, how they can get involved, without having to get them to tick that box. That's still in there, and I checked the Lords' proposed amendments, and there is a proposal to take political parties out of that, but there's no proposal to change the extension of that for not-for-profits. So it's chugging away. That's still in there, but we'll see. ICO guidance, I've actually just, the next 2 slides, I won't read from them, but you will be getting the slides afterwards. So I've just listed and put links to the key guidance, so you'll have those afterwards. So I'll skip over that just for now. Enforcement action, we still get asked quite a lot of questions about where are these big fines. We were told in 2018 we were looking at millions of pounds of fines all of a sudden. And the answer is, you know, that they're really not there, and they're certainly not there in the type of work that we see the charities that we're working with doing. There are charities that get monetary penalties. They are typically up to £20,000 maybe. They are still overwhelmingly for non-compliance with the direct marketing rules, sending texts, sending emails, making phone calls to people about things that fall within that wide definition of marketing without having their opt-in consent. So that's one of still the most frequent reasons for fines being given. And for people complaining, one of the reasons the fines happen is the ICO is basically a reactive regulator. So people complain about that because it's annoying for them. There's probably a lot of non-compliance going on in the background that they never actually know about, so the complaints don't come through. The second one is also still the old devices or records lost, misplaced, post or emails sent to the wrong addresses, including some quite big organisations that really should know better, public authorities. There was a police force that sent details of pension records to the completely wrong addresses quite recently. And the reason to mention that one is that, as well as enforcement action from the regulator, which is where those potentially big fines come, individuals do also have the right to take a claim in the civil courts under the Data Protection Act if they think they've suffered financial loss or even kind of injury to feelings of some sort as a result of a data breach. On that front, so far the awards have been pretty minuscule. In fact, some pretty harsh comments really from judges, just sort of almost having no time for people who are basically arguing because one letter went to the wrong address. My privacy was so invaded that I had to bring this very public case and tell the world how my privacy was invaded. So you can see, I mean, it does seem a little bit harsh in some cases, but sometimes when people really are getting on their high horse about how terrible something has been for them, when you actually look at what has happened, the courts are giving quite short shrift to those kinds of claims. So we're not seeing a lot of that. It's not high value. And as a result, we're not seeing those law firms, what you might call ambulance chasing law firms, kind of go after the group action claims that a lot of people, again, if we go back 5 years or so, were saying, do we think we'll see more of that? No, is the short answer. So I said that I put all these links to guidance. So the main guidance that I think will be helpful, possibly depending on what you do in your charities, guidance on dealing with subject access requests in the employment context. Really quite helpful. A lot of the questions that we get are about how to deal with documents relating to grievances, disciplinaries, witness statements, that kind of thing. The answers, it's done as an FAQ, so the answers are kind of, a lot of them are there. Guidance on sending bulk communications by email and the real pitfalls of using the BCC or attempting to use BCC yourself to send out bulk emails. 10 steps on sharing information to safeguard children, which is really intended to give you reassurance that you can do that. And then some other updates and consultations. There's a consultation going on and various updates being published in sort of phases on employment and data protection. So that includes keeping HR records, recruitment and selection, and use of personal data in that sphere, using HR information, particularly health information, sickness, absence type information, occupational health information, monitoring your workers. So again, pretty helpful stuff. It's the kind of questions that come up quite a bit when we talk to charities. So there is quite a lot out there if you know where to look. And I say that knowing how difficult it can be sometimes to find the nuggets on the ICO's website. And then finally, if you do have a website that's potentially likely to be accessed by children, and you've ever had to try to work out from the children's code whether you are caught by that, the ICO recognised their guidance was pretty unclear and have published clarification on that. So all of those are in slides. I won't go into detail. On the kind of people side, actually quite a lot going on, and certainly can't get into the detail today. I've put in the top box recent discrimination cases. There's a lot going on right now in the development, particularly of cases around the protected characteristic of belief. And it kind of goes hand in hand with a wider conversation really in society about how we balance freedom of expression with people's kind of right not to be hurt or offended or, you know, whatever. Where do we draw those lines? And I think that's definitely coming through in a lot of the discrimination cases. Quite a few of them are around what's termed gender critical beliefs, and you know, not exclusively, but a lot of the cases that have the funding behind them to go to the senior courts and are still working their way through the senior courts are around those cases. So, you know, it is like, to sort of summarise what gender critical beliefs are, although each case the claimant tends to explain what their own version of that means. It's basically the belief that biological sex is immutable, that you can't identify and choose your own gender or have a different gender from your biological sex. So that's broadly the kind of belief that we're talking about. And we know from the case law now that belief is protected under the Equality Act. So if you are having a situation where you're hearing complaints, whether that's in employment complaints in the workforce, or whether it's in the context of members complaining, or whether it's in the context of the services you're providing, it's quite a tricky area at the moment, because these cases are still grappling effectively with how far we can divorce how someone manifests their belief and the belief itself. So that's what the courts are grappling with. The employer or the organisation will typically say, we don't care if the person holds the belief, that's their own business. But if they're going to be telling their colleagues to sign a petition, or tweeting about it, or getting involved in a campaigning group, you know, that offends some of our charity members or something, maybe working with trans people, that's when it becomes our business. And the courts, it's fair to say, really haven't reached a consistent conclusion on how you go about deciding when the belief can be divorced from the manifestation of the belief. So if you are getting any of those kinds of complaints, I would strongly recommend have a chat with us. We're dealing with more than you might imagine of those, coming from quite a few unexpected quarters. So, new legislation, there's quite a bit of it. This April, changes to holiday pay rules come into effect. So anyone who has been following the long and very complicated saga of particularly part-year workers, so maybe school teachers who don't work during summer, or school staff that don't work in summer, or irregular hours staff, and how you calculate their holiday pay, and whether you can pay rolled up holiday pay in the pay. We went through a whole load of case law that basically said you probably can't do what you're doing, and then the government this year has said, well, we're just going to legislate to say you can do what you were always doing all the way along. So basically, that anyone who's familiar with that 12.07% calculation, it's back. You can do it from the 1st of April, and rolled up holiday pay, it's okay. So if that is something that you've been grappling with, then take a look at those changes coming into effect, as I say, from April. Beginning of April also sees amended legislation on flexible working requests. So it's a day one right now. You don't have any qualifying service from 6th of April. And there's some other changes to the process as well for how you deal with flexible working requests. Carers leave is coming in. Changes to paternity leave. You can take paternity leave in 2 non-consecutive weeks. Extended protection from redundancy for people returning from maternity leave or adoption leave. So quite a few of your policies, your kind of family-friendly policies, flexible working policies are probably going to need to be reviewed pretty swiftly. On the horizon, right to request more predictable working pattern if you've got people who have unpredictable work, unpredictable hours. That was something that was recommended years back when the kind of gig economy review was done, and it's due to come into effect in September. And then finally, the Worker Protection Act, which will amend the Equality Act, is due to come in from October. That's the one that is going to place an additional burden on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment of employees in the workplace. So again, we will be doing more updates on those, particularly that last one, what that reasonable steps duty looks like. So if you're not signed up to our e-bulletin, sign up and you'll see that coming through. So I know that was an awful lot in a sort of 10-minute slot. And as I say, it really was just intended to tell you what you should be aware of, and then, you know, come and speak to us or find out more online. I'll hand over to Sam in the interest of being able to be time for questions, and then yeah, we can chat afterwards.
Right, so I'm going to give a quick sort of overview on what's happening in the charity property world. And I mean, really the main thing that's come in is the Charities Act 2022, and it's largely sort of things that help practitioners, things that the state that put in the contract, and so on. But there are some practical, useful changes. So the big change is the way that charities sell or lease land. So at the moment, the previous regime is that if a charity wants to sell or lease land, they have to appoint a bricks qualified surveyor, get a sort of prescribed report. Trustees then consider the report, and there may be advertising requirements in that report, and the charity will have to follow that. So now the Act has slightly made this a bit more flexible, to relaxed it a little bit. So you don't have to get a RICS surveyor anymore. You can also get estate agents and agricultural valuers to do that. And you can even get trustees or members of staff to prepare the report for you. But they would have to have the relevant qualifications. A lot of people in the sector have sort of seen this as a total stripping back of all the restrictions, and we're sort of quick to say, the restrictions are still in place. You have to get a report, and where there's a kind of high value transaction, we'd still strongly recommend you get an external qualified surveyor who's got the benefit of indemnity, professional indemnity insurance, got the experience, and they will prepare the report, because if something goes wrong, trustees can still be held personally liable for that. So it's important that it's done properly. In terms of sort of general property updates, the main thing is probably affecting landlords. So the MEES regulations, so the minimum energy efficient standards, and so that's the EPC certificate. So if you want to sell or lease a building, you have to produce EPC, and it has to have a passing grade. So they get ranked from A to F. And if you have an F or a G rating, and you're letting out property on an existing lease, that's okay. But from the 1st of April, you have to have a minimum of an E rating. And so if you don't comply with this, and compliance normally means putting in sort of energy improvements to the building, if you don't comply, there is a risk of fines, and even they're proposing the government proposing a register where you can see non-compliant buildings, which could be quite embarrassing as well. So there's currently there's not been any enforcement yet. So it's sort of only being enforced at the moment by solicitors, banks. We're what's checking it, but it could be enforced. It's likely it will be enforced in the coming years. And also on the horizon,
Sorry, if tenants refuse the works, what do you do?
There is an exception at the moment. So if the tenants refuse you access to do the works, you can apply for an exemption. And there's another exemption where if you do the works and it's still not very energy efficient, you can also get an exemption there. So that's one way of dealing with it. But no, I don't know if it's actually applied for those exemptions yet. It's simply because the government's not enforcing these rules at the moment. But it's likely they will, and in the future, it's thought that by 2027 you'll need a minimum C rating, and by 2030 it will be a minimum B rating. So if you've got a building and you're planning on letting it out for the next 5 to 10 years, you need to start thinking about this. And from a tenant's perspective as well, you need to try to make sure that the landlord doesn't try and pass on the costs to you. So sometimes they'll try and sneak it into the service charge costs for building. And so if you're negotiating your lease, just have a look at that and make sure that that's not one of the items on the service charge list. Finally, the Building Safety Act 2022. So I don't think this will affect too many charities, but it's essentially new legislation for high risk buildings. So that's buildings that are minimum of 18 meters or 7 stories in height. And it's in response to the Grenfell tragedy. So essentially, there's now a building regulator who you have to register with that regulator, and you also have to have a registered person as well on file, and need to provide some information to the regulator. And again, if you're not on the register and you are in an affected building, there can be fines and enforcement action and so on. Just going to give a quick sort of market overview now on the charity property market. So the charity property has essentially, it's affected in the market the same way that the market is generally. So there's interest rates going up, utilities going up, and so you can see the market slowing a bit. And one of the effects of that is seeing the increase in charities selling historic buildings, selling historic HQs, head offices, and so on, and transitioning into sort of smaller lettings. But the charity market is also sort of a world of its own. And you're also seeing lots of charities who previously were, in the pandemic, for example, were moving into home working. A lot of charities now are starting to come back and are looking for new offices and new methods, and also looking for kind of interesting ways of dealing with that. So having other charities come in on licenses or subletting, but generally the market seems quite stable.
Thank you very much.